1961 saw the publication of a novel which was entitled Too Long in the West. Its author, Balchandra Rajan, has often been accused of having spent most of his life abroad. But here he is with us in India in the studio today, and it's a great pleasure to have him with us. Professor Rajan, you mentioned Gauri Vishwanathan in passing, and her book, The Masks of Conquest, I think was published in some 7 years ago in 1989. Mm-hmm. It's very interesting for me that her work and your projected book should both come from Indian scholars involved with English literary studies, but both scholars have completed their work outside of India. Gauri Vishwanathan's problem is a limited one. She's examining the politics of the Raj and how they influenced the introduction of English literary studies in India. In your case, you're taking the whole question of discourse and you're dealing with the whole spread of literature, history, politics. Do you think there is, a special advantage that a scholar has if that scholar is working or functioning outside the country? Why is it that in India, English is a major discipline at our universities, that scholars within India have not made a major contribution in this kind of critical discourse?
I think that NRIs, if we can call ourselves that, seem to be more worried about what is going wrong. And I think they're worried in particular that we continue to teach English literature more or less as it has always been taught, and that so very little change has taken place in university programs of English studies, even 50 years after, or 49 years after the attainment of India's independence. In North America, we wonder about whether we should continue to go on and on with standard works of standard authors, what we ought to do to liberalize the canon, whether in fact there should be a canon at all, how the canon ought to be situated, how it should be located within a possible context of cultural studies, or whether it is to be located in some other context than that of cultural studies, whether the whole period basis of English, of literary studies is to be followed or discarded, and if it is discarded, what then is to take its place. These are, I suppose, fairly live questions in the Western Academy, though I have to go on to add that precious little is being done in response to these questions. They are asked and argued, and things go on much as they've gone on. But I think there is more of an uneasiness about it than is displayed here. And looking at India from outside, you wonder why, when we are discussing all these things, a country which has become independent is doing so little about its English programs. I was looking at a program by David Suzuki the other day, and it was a program upon Gilgit. Among other things, it deplored the fact that the pastoral peace of Gilgit had been totally destroyed. Lorries and trucks and things were coming in. Modern civilization and computers and all that were coming in there too. But Wordsworth was still being taught there. Wordsworth was still being taught there. And really, when Macaulay talks about his imperishable empire, the imperishable empire of English arts and letters, you have that imperishable empire with a vengeance when Wordsworth is being taught in Gilgit. Should we not perhaps teach something else in Gilgit?
I share your concerns, Professor Rajan, very intensely. And what does amaze me is that at the level of political discourse, our country during its national movement made major contributions, not just to its own freedom struggle, but I think to an understanding of this whole problem of the conquered versus the conquerors. And whereas many of the insights of people like Frantz Fanon, even of Edward Said, are anticipated in the political writings of Gandhi, of Aurobindo, even of Vivekananda, this does not reflect itself in the academic work of teachers of English. And if you look at the whole range of disciplines, if there is one discipline where you see that it is there because of political reasons, it is the discipline of English. I mean, it is the politics of the Raj that made English a major discipline at our universities. And anyone who starts teaching English this fact should stare one in the face. And still, after independence, a few individual scholars have seen things in perspective. They've broken new grounds. There have been some teachers of English who, while they taught English for a living, did their creative writing or their critical writing in a regional language and made major contributions. Harivansh Rai Bachchan has made a major contribution to Hindi poetry. Ayappa Panikar has pioneered modernism in Malayalam poetry. And so on, one could go on listing them. And your own student, Hiren Gohain, has done very commendable work as a critic vis-a-vis Assamese literature. But by and large, departments of English or Indian universities as institutions have ignored this challenge. And yet when some of the African countries got independence, people like Ngugi, for example, were so forthright in departing from the old practices and in defining their new goals. Why has it not happened in India?
Well, it may be for you rather than for me to answer that question. I think that there is, I think India does suffer from institutional inertia to a higher degree than other countries do, perhaps. And I think institutional inertia, the kind of petrification which James Mill and other people have bludgeoned India with in the past, does seem to be almost exemplarily illustrated in the Department of English, which I suppose is, being a creation of the Raj, might be expected to reflect some of those principles.
Does it not reflect more the price we paid for the Raj? Because it wouldn't have been there but for the Raj.
Yes.
English as a major discipline at our universities. And English has become part of our class system in India.
Yes,
and we are happy to hold on to those positions of privilege in our society that English has given us access to, I think.
Yes.
But what would you see as the direction we should be taking with regard to the teaching of English, and I include both language and literature, at our universities?
I think that we could start with Gauri Vishwanathan's proposal, which is an extremely modest one. She is incidentally, let me put in a plug for my future book on Milton. She's doing an essay on the imperial canon and the colonial classroom for Milton and the imperial vision, from which I expect great things. her proposal essentially is that one should teach English literature with a much greater awareness of the imperial presence in the body of that literature. And I really think that in teaching English literature in India, the fact that it is the literature of an imperial power and should be examined in relation to the imperial claim is something which ought to be responded to with particular sensitivity in India. The second chapter of my book, if I ever do finish it, is called The Luciads and the Asian Reader. Now, of course, when I mentioned the Asian reader in that way, I was really thinking of my first book on the 17th century reader, and I thought that since if I began my career by postulating a reader of one kind, I might end it perhaps by postulating a reader of a spectacularly different kind. But the Asian reader is the product of a different historical and cultural experience, and my point is that when the Asian reader reads, he must be taught, and should in his nature, read differently. And we're not taking up at all the problem of how we should read differently, how Western works are to be differently read by us, because we have been a subject people, we have been a colonized people, we have come out of that, that's part of our history and our background and even our trauma, and we should read Western works from a different point of view altogether from those who have triumphantly proclaimed the superiority of the West and the title to dominance of the West in their works.
At the political level, we were willing and able to do that.
Yes.
English brought in their language to India as an instrument of governance. They did not have to learn our languages, and they could still rule over us. And yet I often think that our leaders during the national movement, our intellectuals, turned English to excellent use. They turned it around as a medium for interpreting India's political aspirations to the electorate in England. And if India had not succeeded in doing that, the Labour government may not have given us independence as rapidly or as quickly as it did. We were using English, whether it was Gandhiji or it was Aurobindo or it was Nehru, as a political weapon against British dominance. But why we should not have similarly responded at other levels, I'm unable to understand. And it isn't that departments of English have not drawn their fair proportion of talent. In fact, I think on the whole, departments of English are somewhat more privileged. If you meet people from these departments, they are more widely read. Their horizons are wider than those you come across from many other language and literature departments in the country.
But would you not say they're operating within a syllabus that makes it rather difficult to exhibit those talents?
It's up to them to change the syllabus.
Yes.
Why haven't they? But that point you made...
Well, I can only say that there is obviously a massive institutional inertia. And if you ask what, to ask what justifies that inertia is a silly question, because there's nothing whatever to justify it. But
I've often thought myself that India as a civilization has been strong in giving freedom to the individual, but it hasn't really functioned in strength at the institutional level and at when you look at organized religion. We've never been strong on that front, but we've had gurus and mystics coming up in succession. And he does not start, but his disciples start a new sect, as it were. And the process is unending. It's a constant process of birth, growth, decay. There is a renewal built into it. But when I visited the excavations at Nalanda, I was really taken aback that for centuries a great university had flourished there. It had undergone changes, it had been built and rebuilt, but it had carried on. And it wasn't until politically it was destroyed by a conqueror that institution, which had gained international recognition, came to an end. And so I'm not that convinced that we are incapable of building great institutions. But why we haven't done that with regard to our universities, I don't know. In fact, I often refer to Indian university education at the moment in terms of what I call the Penelope syndrome. New universities are brought into being, the UGC and the state governments pump money into them. And our resources are limited. In terms of those resources, the money that is siphoned off is substantial. Meanwhile, our leading universities are progressively dying. Calcutta, Nagpur, Allahabad, Lucknow, I think Delhi is also on the list. We have more than 150,000 students. We'll die of our own weight.
America, I think that university excellence is secured by certain schools which are not dependent upon government aid. Cornell, for example, is a land-grant university, and the revenue from the land which has been granted to it finances the university. The Ivy League schools have enormous private endowments which free them from government support, the necessity of government support, and it enables them to carry out and execute the idea of a university as they think fit. In doing so, they set a standard for other universities, to which other universities must conform, however reluctantly. But I don't think that we have universities of that nature in India. For that matter, we don't have universities of that nature in Canada either. And I think without the presence of certain standard-bearing universities, which put before us the levels of achievement which it is necessary for us to attain, we will tend to slip back into the kind of mediocrity, I suppose, at which one falls back out of sheer laziness. But apart from that, I think that we really do need to look at the problem of what to do with English in Indian universities. I think that, as I've already indicated, Gauri Vishwanathan's proposal is a modest proposal. You could still teach English according to periods. You could still teach English according to standard authors, but you could change the nature of that teaching. It's simply a matter of taking the major works of English literature and insisting that they be viewed in a different light. Of course, that will mean that the probable questions in the examination will then become different probable questions, but that is all to the good. I see no reason why a evolutionary change of that nature cannot be effected within things even as they are, and I suppose one has to also want to change the structure of things as they are. Apart from Vishwanathan's proposal, there is, I think, Spivak's view that one ought to be studying other languages in relation to literature in English, and not simply study literature in English in isolation. There's Ijaz Ahmed's view that we ought to be studying English literature within a cultural context. And one of the things that does strike me as singular is that we seem to study English literature in no context at all. When a Western country studies, let us say, Chinese literature, it studies it within the context of a firm cultural understanding about itself. Now, when we study English literature, which is after all not our literature, we too should study it within a firm sense of cultural understanding about ourselves. We need to have a course on India's culture. More specifically, a course which would emphasize the extraordinary coherence of Indian culture and all its aspects, the relationship that clearly exists between music and dance and poetry and drama in the Indian cultural totality. I don't think that kind of coherence is in fact exhibited in the cultures of other countries. Well, we ought to be studying it, and we ought to take in English literature into a kind of field which is already there and locate it properly within that field. We don't do so. We don't receive English literature in that way at all. We take it as if it were complete in itself.
Well, I suppose at the individual level, some of this is being done by some of the teachers.
Yes, sir.
At Baroda, Professor P.C. Carr has already designed an optional course. It's a full paper on the historical. It takes up the study of the history of English studies in India. So it inculcates a new self-consciousness amongst future teachers of English about the placement of their discipline. And I think some individual teachers have started reading the imperial discourse into the texts that they are teaching. And I imagine more of this will follow. But your insistence that we need to take a more or less holistic view of Indian culture and make that the basis from which we approach Western literatures, I think it's, you have to be located and rooted in your own.
Yes, I think we need a compulsory course on Indian culture for anyone who wants to do anything in the humanities.
Well, let's hope that we move in that direction. And this seems a large undertaking, but it would also make for interdisciplinary work. I think the kind of discipline-based teaching that we've imported at our universities from the West has stood in the way. And our universities have not found bridges between discipline and discipline.
No. And at one point, the University of Toronto made it a qualification for the PhD that you should take a course outside English. If you wanted to qualify for a PhD in English, you had to take a graduate course outside English. It's since abandoned that requirement, but I think such a requirement would be quite useful in an Indian context. You should take one course that isn't about English literature if you want to qualify for a PhD in English literature, and that course should be at the graduate level.
Well, I hope by the time your book is published, at least at some universities, some of these changes that you've been speaking of may have made their first beginnings.
And what are the language requirements in the English PhD? Is there a language requirement?
There is none that I am aware of at the moment. We've sometimes English departments have recruited students who wish to work on European literatures. We had a student who wanted to work on Brecht. And at that time, my department made it a requirement. She was a teacher of English.
Yes.
Made it a requirement that she learn German.
Yes.
But apart from that, I have not known English departments or even other departments insisting on language requirements.
Well, it's a standard requirement in a North American PhD that you should have some knowledge of 2 languages other than English if you're to qualify for a PhD in English. Now, why can't you have knowledge of 2 Indian languages?
That knowledge is pretty.
PhD in English.
That knowledge is pretty common in the country, but it has not yet been incorporated as an academic requirement. Yes, it simply needs to be formalized. But in our classrooms, most of the students know 2 to 3 languages besides English. In fact, I've often thought of this as a very special kind of privilege we have. We work within a multilingual classroom. Well, thank you, Professor Rajan. It's been extremely interesting and thought-provoking having this, being in conversation with you. And we will now look forward to the publication of your book. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much.